Take it there, who gon' take it there, who gon' take it there, who gon' take it there? Electricity, 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 electricity. You know what's in the air, you know what's in the air, you know what's in the air, you know what's in the air. It's possibility, it's possibility, it's possibility, it's possibility.
So Joe Rogan, the brave truth teller, truth seeker, fighter for free speech, all around talker of words good. On his recent episode of the Joe Rogan Experience featuring Joey Diaz, one of his longtime friends, went on a rant about freedom of speech that I think is very telling and very much reflects the lack of understanding that these guys have about what free speech actually means. And none of that is new, but I think this current example is really interesting because it's actually very urgent right now. The issue of free speech is more urgent right now than it has ever been. And that's curious. That's something that these guys like Rogan and people in his sphere of influence are not really equipped to deal with, because they spent the last 4 years and longer complaining that they were being censored by Democrats, the Democrat regime, the cabal, whatever. I mean, it's amazing what you can get away with accusing people of when you lump an entire, the entire structure of the United States, private and public, together and pretend they're all acting in tandem. And what that allows you to do is, if you get reprimanded by YouTube or kicked off Facebook for saying a slur or something like that, if you view that as a direct action of the state rather than an action of that private company, that allows you to say Joe Biden is censoring me and Democrats are pro-censorship. So that's the position they've taken all leading up to this moment and leading up to the second election of Donald Trump. And it's always been clear to people who understand free speech understanders, you could call them, that this is a misappropriation, a misuse of the complaint about free speech, the raising of alarm that free speech is under attack. These guys are abusing their ability to raise that alarm. And that has brought us to the moment that we're at, where they being people like Joe Rogan, and especially and specifically Joe Rogan, have facilitated for the full-on takeover of our government by anti-free speech zealots, people who are more vociferously anti-free speech than I would say any president I've seen in my lifetime. And you can make this argument. You can say that every president is anti-free speech in some way. It is absolutely true that the government of the United States has always clamped down on some aspects of free speech in some places. And even the ways that I'm going to highlight that the Trump administration is going after free speech was also still happening under Biden. And Biden, in many ways, like he did for many things, laid the groundwork for Trump to assault free speech directly. However, that direct assault on free speech, directly sending the feds after people who are exercising their free speech, not to scare them, not to have a nice little chat with them, but to arrest them and deport them, that is a real, direct, and urgent assault on free speech. And so Joe Rogan here on his podcast is pontificating about the importance of free speech and what it means to have free speech. And obviously Joe Rogan, is one of the leading philosophers of our time, has a lot of really interesting things to say about that. So let me play this clip real quick so we can get an interesting peek into the complicated and curious mind of Joe Rogan.
That's one of the reasons why America became so powerful. The two things: the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, like that stuff. All the laws that gave you freedom of speech, the right to bear arms, right to practice your own religion, all those things are incredible. But also the type of people that moved here. Crazy, risk-taking motherfuckers that were willing to get their kids and get on a boat. We're in in a weird time here where people are arguing about whether or not we should abandon core principles that made this country great. Like very intelligent, liberal people with degrees are talking about the First Amendment should have restrictions. Like, no, you gotta be able to say whatever they want. And then you decide if you want to communicate with people that speak differently than you. And if you think that they have an egregious position, you're allowed to say something about it. And you talk about it. And everybody has to figure out who's right and who's wrong. And if you just like cut that off for things that you find offensive, the problem is maybe I don't find it offensive. And you can't decide what I can take in and not take in. You're not allowed to, because I don't know you and you don't know me. This is nonsense.
So this clip really just starts out hilarious with Joe kind of giving his general thoughts on free speech. And he says, there's two important things that, make America great. The Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, Bill of Rights, and he lists, so that's three, so okay. But he's our brave free speech warrior, philosopher king. So it's okay that he's a little bit light on the math. That's fine, because his job, his specialty is deep thinking, okay? Deeply held civic beliefs, okay, that undergird our society. And the espousing of those beliefs is kind of what's holding us all up right now, right? It's holding democracy together. Joe Rogan single-handedly. So he gets into this idea of free speech and the fact that Democrats and the crazy wokes were attacking free speech because they don't agree with something that you said, and, well, you can't dictate what other people find offensive, so therefore your opinion on what is offensive does not allow you to restrain other people's free speech. Okay, that's fine. And the obvious point here is that Joe Rogan is talking mostly, if you're talking about Democrats, Joe Rogan is talking about censorship on platforms, right? Spotify, Facebook, YouTube, whatever it may be. They're censoring certain kinds of speech. And this is not new. Certainly still happens under Donald Trump. Things have shifted a little bit in terms of where the hot button censorship topics are. But for the most part, it's still happening. And for a lot of these companies, their rules really haven't changed. Twitter has obviously changed a lot. Facebook, I think Zuckerberg is kind of, making moves towards the right to appeal to the Trump administration, so that affects Instagram as well. But for the most part, I don't think that the general logic of what is allowed and what isn't has changed that much across the internet, although it probably will. However, when you're talking about private companies like this, you're talking about companies that have the right to make their own determination about what they believe is appropriate. And so, does that maybe lead them to making certain draconian restrictions sometimes, or applying restrictions in ways that don't make sense? Yeah, it does. A good example would be like the phrase "follow your leader" as a way of telling Nazis to kill themselves is something that I have seen multiple people get banned from social media from. Temporary bans or whatever. Now, I mean, if you really examine that, first of all, it is a reference to the idea of saying kill yourself, but you're saying it in a very specific way. You're saying follow your leader, which implies that this is a follower of Hitler, because if you're not, then taking that as a suicide reference doesn't make any sense. So people were getting censored for that on Facebook and other platforms for a long time, before Trump came around the second time, probably even before he came around the first time. So, I mean, that's an example of the fact that they try to have an even-handed approach, but oftentimes that leads to weird, vague insinuations like that being banned, whereas sometimes outright hate speech is allowed to survive for much longer because they target certain keywords and phrases. So people who are actively trying to find creative ways to spread their bigotry on social media are able to get around the rules, whereas people who are just a little annoyed by seeing, open white supremacy and Nazism on their feed are banned for hate speech. Same thing with like engaging with transphobes, right? You tell a transphobe that, you know, called you a slur, that they should kill themselves, especially with the way things are today, especially on Twitter. You're probably going to get banned for that. Whether or not they will, who knows? So, you know, there's lots of examples of how the way they apply these rules doesn't make that much sense. And so there's plenty of criticisms to be drawn there. And if people on the right wing have issues with certain things that are being censored, another good example would be like Hunter Biden's laptop, right? That, I think, gets to the core of the issue that we're talking about here. Because Twitter, at the time, which was where the Hunter Biden story was initially censored and not allowed to appear on the platform, they said that they didn't want to host that story because it had to do with hacked materials. And other people who wanted the story to be heard said that that's bullshit. They're just doing that because of the administration. The administration asked them to censor it. I don't think there's ever been any evidence of that. The only thing that I think the administration asked specifically to be censored was like nude photos of Hunter Biden that leaked. So if you look at this from the perspective of a private business, and especially with something like hacked materials. Okay, so some incredibly sensitive stuff gets hacked. People want to leak it out on the internet. And the problem is that company, in some sense, is going to be liable for that. Just like they're liable for the censorship of that information, they are also liable for what that information is and how it was ascertained. And if that information spreads to a level that causes damage to somebody's reputation that they could claim is defamatory because they did not adequately scrutinize the content that they were hosting on their platform. Again, we're not talking about like a little statement here and there. We're talking about huge news stories in the middle of an election that have a ton of reach. So you could argue that, you know, by censoring that, they're interfering with the election, and it's more about political motivations than any type of technical rules or anything like that. And I think that there's probably some truth to that. But the reality stands that private entity has the right to decide that they don't want to host that speech, especially if it possibly is going to cause them some kind of litigation in the future. And when you're talking about private information from a private citizen that was illegally obtained, now you're definitely talking about something that people can be held accountable for. And so in other words, if we're talking about free speech, we're talking about what the government has the right to stop you from doing. The government does not have the right to stop you from saying certain things. It doesn't have the right to punish you or go after you for saying certain things. And while I do think that there's a small argument to be made about, you know, the government leaning on social media companies to get them to acquiesce to what they believe is the right content to be censoring, and that there are obviously political motivations that could cause that type of thing. I think that's probably true. Definitely, we're already seeing it in the case of the Trump administration, and that's probably not that much of a departure from what's happened in the past. And you could argue that there are free speech concerns there, that if the government is leaning on private companies telling them what kind of free speech they can and can't host, that's bad. But if you can't substantiate that, then your claim is garbage. And it's also not really engaging with the reality that private company has the right to say you can and can't host whatever they want to say. They don't have to host speech that they don't want to host. And that goes for every platform that Joe Rogan is on and every other platform out there. It goes for every restaurant that you enter. I mean, Joe Rogan owns a comedy club. So if somebody walks in there and walks on stage and starts trashing Joe Rogan and trashing the whole Austin comedy scene for being, you know, bigoted and mean-spirited and not funny, maybe they're not going to drag him off the stage. They might, but they're almost certainly not going to have him back. And that's Joe Rogan's right. If Joe Rogan doesn't like your speech in his establishment, he doesn't have to host it there. It's pretty reasonable, right? And so my problem here when it comes to Joe is that he's missing something very important. they have allowed their brains to be filled with this idea that they're being censored by the government, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, whoever else, George Soros, is coming after them for their free speech. And so they've been raising the alarm, and that has fueled their advocacy of Donald Trump to come in and fix this problem. They say that all the time, that the reason a guy like Donald Trump comes in is because the Democrats are attacking free speech and doing blah, blah, blah. And so you got to have somebody like Trump to come in here and clean the situation up. Okay, so now we have that. And what we immediately get out the gate is Donald Trump sending the feds to arrest students and others for free speech regarding Palestine. So this is not only a free speech imperative. These are students on college campuses who have the right to do this speech. They have the right to organize, which is also explicitly in the Constitution, and to gather in public. And yet the government, under Donald Trump, is specifically attacking them and arresting them and deporting them, attempting to deport them, probably has deported a couple people already that have not gotten the same amount of coverage. And these guys do not have the ability to grasp that as it's happening, because they've convinced themselves that free speech and an assault on free speech is something different than it is. They don't actually understand what it looks like when someone goes after free speech, because they've allowed the Alex Joneses, the Tucker Carlsons, and the Joe Rogans of the world to convince them that an assault on free speech looks like what you are and aren't allowed to say on social media, and does not look like what you are and aren't allowed to say on a college campus. That's a very important distinction. And even if a college campus wanted to sanction certain kinds of speech, you could argue that's more ethically dubious, but they do it. And not all colleges are public institutions. I believe the ones where people are being targeted are private institutions. But still, it's not the colleges that are making this call. It's the government. The government is deciding not that they're going to lean on these institutions so that they have harsher restrictions and whatever. Again, that's probably some kind of breach of free speech as well. But they are literally sending feds, sometimes unmarked, unidentified feds, to go and grab these people with no warrants and no warning and no due process. And in the case of Mahmoud Khalil, and in the case of the woman Ozturk or Yunseo Chung, who is now suing the administration back, they're not being charged with any crime. They're being punished because of what they've said. There's nothing about their conduct or anything or their status as residents in America. Nothing about it would lead the feds to come to them other than the fact that they have agitated in favor of Palestine. And so not only is that a free speech issue where, the feds are targeting them for things that they've said, which is what the right-wingers have been screaming about for the last 10 years, but it's a free speech issue in the sense that this is one of the most important foreign policy issues of our time. This is not just free speech about this or that. This is free speech about the weapons that our tax dollars are going to and the weapons that we are sending over to Israel to enact the genocide that they are enacting. If you speak about that, if you organize to the end of stopping that, especially on a college campus, that makes you liable to be attacked, arrested, and deported by the feds. That is an assault on free speech. So why isn't Joe Rogan talking about that? Why aren't these other brave free speech warriors talking about that? A couple of them have. Tim Dillon has. Because a couple of them recognize that, maybe this was a little bit of an okey doke. Maybe this assault on free speech that's happening right now isn't good just because it's happening by my team. And look, I can and would criticize assaults on free speech by the Biden administration. You simply didn't see it to this same scale. I'm not saying you didn't see it. And like I said, Biden kind of opened the door to the idea of revoking visas for students on these campuses who were immigrants who participated in these protests. That was something that Biden mentioned while he was still in office, because he was under a lot of pressure from Israel advocacy groups to do the same thing that Trump's doing. The only difference is that Trump is willing to send the feds in and arrest people. Trump doesn't give a fuck about people's rights, doesn't give a fuck about the Constitution, doesn't give a fuck about whether or not people who are residents in America have access to constitutional rights. He doesn't even care about arbitrating any of that. He just says, get them out, arrest them as soon as possible. Let's get them out of the country as soon as possible so we can wash our hands of it and say, hey, look, there's nothing I can do to get them back. That's the plan here. And these guys who have been telling us that the Biden administration is, an authoritarian takeover, communist, this or that, are completely blind to the fact that Trump is actively attacking free speech. And I think Rogan is a little bit more tied to Trump at this point. I don't know that he could say that. Well, I mean, he can say whatever he wants, but the problem is that he doesn't want to say that. He doesn't want to damage the relationship with Trump because Rogan is in a position where he has a real voice. If he said something about this, the administration would probably hear it. But he doesn't want to do that because it's a lot easier to just kind of like look up and just sort of vaguely pontificate about the Constitution and free speech. And the closest he's come, he's talked a little bit about these deportations with no due process. And he said, wow, that's crazy. I mean, if that's really going on, if we're really doing that, that seems crazy, right? That's about the most that he said about it. And, it's just pathetic because this guy has a real voice. Trump apparently has even admitted that Joe Rogan was a big part of helping him get elected. And so if he has concerns about free speech, if he has concerns about people being deported with no due process, he's probably the one to speak up about it. If there's any podcaster in the world who has the ability to get that message, not just to the Trump administration, but to Trump himself, it's Joe Rogan. And so, I mean, I think it's just farcical that he's sitting on his platform and whinging about free speech when he knows, I know he knows what's happening right now. And he doesn't want to speak to that because he knows that it would be a direct affront to Trump. Criticizing the actual policy, a specific person that was targeted, deported because of a specific thing that they were saying. That's a specific critique that Joe Rogan could make of the Trump administration, but won't. And the reason is because he's scared and he likes the status that he has by being somebody who's in Trump's orbit. And he likes that being on the Trump team feels cool right now. And so he wants to play into that. And he's willing to make harsh criticisms of the side that he doesn't associate himself with. But for the side that he does associate himself with, even though he's independent, he's not, listen, I'm just kind of on both sides, But he really doesn't want to upset that right wing right now because he knows that if he goes too far against the right wing, not only is the government possibly going to punish him for it, but a large section of his audience is going to revolt. And so that's really where the threat to Joe Rogan's free speech lies, is that if he were to speak up about this administration in a specific targeted way, and especially in a repetitive way, the way he talks about wokeness, the way he talks about whatever the fuck, he's repetitively bringing up these topics. If he was doing that about Trump's assaults on free speech, it would make some real noise, and Trump would probably retaliate. So that's an assault on free speech. So if Joe Rogan was really a free speech warrior, if he was really about that free speech life, that's the line he would be pushing. But instead, he's just vaguely pontificating about, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution is what makes America so cool, man. And Democrats, why are you being so uncool? It's a good question. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. And if you really want to support, consider becoming a member. That's the best way to support this channel. I'm posting all kinds of stuff there, like exclusive podcasts, movie reviews, book reviews, stuff that doesn't get posted on the main page. I'm also posting a lot of music there. I just dropped an EP called Dead Internet Theory as a members only video right now. It's going to come out later this week. But if you're interested in hearing that early, go ahead and become a member. And if there's other kinds of content that you would like to hear or other types of stuff you're interested, let me know and we'll figure some things out.